Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on our very special series on global politics on the KJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here as always.
Welcome. Several big topics again today, and the big one is the Hezbollah, the pager, the Mossad, the Israel, and so many things happening. What is this all about? Means has Mossad or Israel suddenly become so strong, so powerful, people who can plan so many things?
Well, while Israel has not officially admitted to being behind the operation, they definitely stand to gain the most from it. Hezbollah has become Iran's most dangerous proxy in the region, but they are also, to some extent, easy to manipulate due to their paranoia and due to their obsession as seeing Israel as an archenemy and as a superpower. They were apparently easily convinced that Israel's spyware was targeting their cell phones with capabilities that were previously impossible to manage, which led them to decide to move to the pager system because pagers use radio waves as opposed to the mobile phones and thought to be safer for security reasons. And of course, um, then what happened was that a series of mysterious shell companies appeared, built over a number of years. They started producing pagers, and the pagers for Hezbollah were produced separately. They were laced with explosives. Moles on Hezbollah end convinced the leadership there to go in the direction of that particular company, and the rest is history. Once everything was ready, the message was sent to these pagers, and they exploded, actually mostly wounding rather than killing people. Those were micro explosions designed to strike surgically and to avoid high civilian casualty counts.
Right, right, Irina. So a year back, everyone was asking about October 7 attack. What was the intelligence agency in Israel doing and all this? Now, one may ask about what are these intelligent minds in the Hezbollah camp or the Iranian camp or all those people? How could they not understand these things? These things need a lot of planning, and they have been using the same pagers for quite some time. Help us understand then. Is it a big flaw was that there in their system and suddenly led to so many deaths on their side?
Well, first of all, they did have people who were specifically pushing to be using these particular pagers and claiming that they were the safest. Second, there were other counterintelligence failures. In their rush to get to these pagers, they didn't do the due diligence. Had they done so, they would have discovered that the companies behind the manufacturing were all paper companies that did not really exist, and that these pages were not trackable to where they were claimed to be produced. On the other hand, they did they did start to get suspicious about the pagers, and there are rumors that some of the pagers in an American medical hospital were changed 2 weeks before the operation, and that's why the operation was rushed to ensure that before they change it everywhere else, that they could still um, that the operation would move forward. So it actually took place sooner than expected. It might have lasted even longer, but it was good timing for a different reason. Hezbollah has been escalating its attacks on Israel's northern borders, and this operation sent a very strong message. It caused massive disarray and disruptions, not only to communications but also to the fighters, and isolated Nasrallah from some of his advisors who were killed or disabled in action.
Right, right. So earlier there was this suspicion that maybe uh, they intercepted the consignment in between and injected all those explosives into them. But now more details are coming, more reports I see is talking about that shell companies were there, and actually they made these pager devices, and that consignment actually was delivered to Hezbollah, and the shell companies were all owned by Israeli interests. How
Yes,
does that means that sounds like almost like a movie, and only one name comes in, that only Mossad could have done some sort this sort of a planning and operation.
well, it's true that Mossad has a record of similar, very highly detailed and realistic scenarios that they built to achieve a particular objective. The Red Sea Resort comes to mind, which was built entirely to for a particular mission to transport Ethiopian Jews back in the day, and they actually created a running resort that was functioning and accepting tourists. Uh, Another similar scenario was using a cell phone with a bomb to kill off Hamas engineer responsible for 150 deaths through explosions. So that was kind of a prototype using a small micro explosion that was surgical and precise. But in this case, they didn't just need to get a hold of one device, which was, complicated but possible. They had to in order to be able to get all the people that they needed, they had to have access to the entire line of devices, and so it was actually easier to create a fictitious company that was in and insert itself into the business than infiltrate an existing supply chain where there could have been more questions about who these people were and what was going on. That said, it would be interesting to watch if other intelligence agencies will learn from the separation and find ways of disrupting supply chains for their adversaries. If that becomes possible, that would be an interesting development for sure.
Right. Now, where from here? Means all this, does it mean that peace will again have to wait for a long, long time? And it is not just the US presidential elections results, but also by itself, the Middle East has become a bit more, place to be concerned about. And also, does it also mean that, that Hamas is in the background, and now it's Israel and Hezbollah much more than that? And here, Houthis also coming into the picture, and they want to go for a long, long war against Israel. How do you think all these things will pan out?
I mean, I think that now is a good time to strike back against these proxies as much as possible because no administration wants a full blown war, so there is an effort to de escalate by actually putting more pressure on all these entities. But the war in Gaza is probably not going to be over anytime soon. The issues are intractable. Sinwar is refusing to compromise in any reasonable way. He was offered the deal to leave Gaza if he returned all the hostages at once, but Hamas clearly is hoping at an opportunity for survival. They are hoping perhaps that Kamala Harris will win, and under pressure to her constituents in the US will put more pressure on Israel. Regardless, they're not going anywhere. The Houthis are becoming more dangerous, it is true, but they are also a great distance away from Israel. So it's probably going to be a long time before they get to the level of organization of Hezbollah.
Right,
Hezbollah
right.
remains the most dangerous of all these proxies, and it's also unlikely to back down quickly, even with all the casualties and problems it has suffered and all the issues it has to deal with. Because for them it would mean a big loss of face in the region after the humiliation Iran has experienced recently with the assassination of the Hamas leader Haniyeh in its own territory.
Right, right. And you talked about Kamala Harris. People are expecting, some her to come into a very strong position. And amidst all these things, with polls favoring Harris, there is the second assassination attempt against Trump. What is happening in the U.S.? Does this show security failure? Does it show, something else? Can people also start thinking that that it is all a way of also garnering support? How do you look at that? How should a person sitting in India understand all these things happening, and who is actually the real favorite? Is Harris going to win actually?
In terms of the assassination, it's not a show from Trump, although he's certainly trying to capitalize on it as much as possible. The assassination attempt was real and is being treated as such. Moreover, the would-be assassin's son was separately indicted on child pornography charges, so it's definitely a kooky family. And there's a lot of weird things about the story. Uh, Supposedly the Secret Service actually acted more or less responsibly. It was a different set of circumstances, a big golf field. But on the other hand, there are rumors that there may have been a leak of information about Trump's whereabouts because he was not supposed to be in that location that day. And the individual who Ruth, the would be assassin, is known for having written a book, and supposedly calling on Iran to send Afghans and Pakistanis to Ukraine to fight against Putin, which is a very bizarre claim given that Iran has been backing Russia in this war. Why would they sacrifice their foreign legions for the sake of confronting Russia when they're allies? It just makes no sense. So there's a lot of also speculation that this guy may have been some sort of a foreign provocateur who was designed to cause mayhem, not so much as killing Trump. And this is how this is playing out at the moment. Um, as for Kamala Harris, her numbers are rising overall, but it's still going to be a very tough and close election, and every day brings some changes. Trump is competitive in some of the leading key swing districts, and he's been saying a lot of things that are quite disturbing and probably are not helping him with the numbers, but it's also hard to rely on the polls because fewer and fewer people actually answer the polls, much less Trump supporters tend to not engage with the journalists. So it's really hard to say how big of a lead she actually has, and most polls are showing that they're still in dead heat in many of the key areas.
Right. So is it because Kamala Harris, she is leading because she is doing some things right? Or is it because Trump is not doing all things right and some things wrong? Or is it Kamala Harris is suddenly coming out as a charismatic candidate?
I doubt it. I think the real reason is that Trump is managing to alienate a lot of potential supporters simply by being himself and not doing the basics of even trying to appeal to the middle of the country. It was his election to lose because the Biden administration proved so weak on so many questions. And just today, Harris gave a speech on her plan in Pittsburgh, and Pennsylvania is one of those states that's been hard hit by various economic issues, and Harris said nothing about reconstructing communities devastated by unemployment and death of the industries in those areas. Her talk was all about, taxes and, temporary measures for small businesses, no big picture issue, no big plan for revitalizing the economy, nothing of that sort. So she's definitely not a visionary, she's not charismatic. She's just following rote, repetitive points and not really elaborating too much aside from what she had revealed at the debate.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on from that story to another story. That too in the U.S. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He was in the U.S. Just a few days back, and there a lot of action was happening. The UN UN General Assembly thing, the Quad meeting, and so many other diaspora meetings. How do you see this visit? What can you say in terms of how India presented itself at the Quad as well as the UN General Assembly, and then there was this whole summit of the future.
Well, interestingly enough, Prime Minister Modi did not address the General Assembly. He only appeared at summit for the futures, but it was still a very important gathering with a lot of leaders. And I think the bilaterals with US and other countries and the Quad meeting were the most important parts of the trip. Although, of course, the meetings with the diaspora were also impactful and meaningful. But in terms of actual advances in relationships, it was the Quad meetings and the bilaterals that brought on the most agreements and changes. I think India is positioning itself to be the leader of the Quad. This is Biden's last Quad. India is set to host the next event in 2025. It's not clear who the next US president is going to be or what their policy is going to be, but there is an expectation of some level of continuity, even if the emphasis on particular issues could shift to the priorities of the next administration. There's been a lot of very successful agreements, although not issues have been resolved. For instance, there's a general push to get more American tech to India, which is great, but so far the issue about the engines that are supposed to be being transferred still has yet to be expedited and fully resolved. On the other hand, there's been a lot of agreements on maritime security, on logistics centers, of course, the cancer initiative to um, to give women vaccines against HPV vaccines to prevent cervical cancer. That's an important humanitarian joint action to which India also donated money, and of course the launch of a space program involving an Indian astronaut. I think is a huge inspiration and it's very exciting, positive civilian development. Um, so there's definitely a lot going on. A lot's been achieved, and the one dark part in the middle of this is that right before all these meetings, the White House granted a meeting to the Palestinian separatist activists who expressed their concerns about India and basically wanted reassurances from the White House about the defense of their interests. So there's been a lot of concern about what that could mean for the future. I think there is a general consensus that Trump would particularly not be very interested in that issue. He would be more concerned about tariff barriers and trade and things like that. Harris would probably be much more interested in that, but she could also have her own program focused on environmental issues and kind of soft power issues involving women empowerment and issues of that sort that could end up taking more of a priority. But she is still more likely to listen to these voices that go on about democracy, rule of law, and minority issues. So that would be a challenge, which I think will require further dialogue and discussion between the Indian government and the White House.
Absolutely. And in fact, when you're talking about the Khalistani issue, there's this whole issue of, India's name coming in, or, about openly supplying Ukraine with ammunition. And that is a thing that is, that might ruffle a lot of feathers in Russia. But then Pakistan name is also coming in. So I want to understand, what do you think is actually happening on the ground? Will India ever do such a thing openly without, at the risk of risking the relationship with Russia?
Well, quite frankly, as I pointed out previously, Russia needs India a lot more than the other way around. India is basically the biggest point of relations between India and Russia has always been the defense industry. Now, India is diversifying; they're growing. They're both growing their own defense industry and also buying top-notch Western weapons from France, Israel, the United States, and other countries. So Russia is far less of a factor. There is still needed for logistics in terms of transporting goods to the Middle East due to the disruption of the maritime routes by the Houthis. But presumably that issue will going to be resolved sooner or later. Russia is still a good market for Indian goods. It still has a populace, a big population, and still's got a lot of important products that are valuable in terms of exchanges, including at one point a cheap source of energy. But even that is being cracked down upon due to sanctions, and also due to the fact that Russia itself can no longer afford such low prices in general. So that advantage is also being erased. So India understands that first of all, producing ammunition for Ukraine is good business. So why not? And Russia cannot risk losing its one of its most important trade partners over that issue by trying to dictate India what to produce. That's one thing. The other thing is that there is also a subtle signal to Russia because Russia has been courting Pakistan, and that started quite openly under Imran Khan, and it continues now even with him in prison. So definitely, I don't think India is happy about that.
Okay, okay. A lot of international diplomacy happening here, a lot of international events happening here. And another event that is happening is Canadian intelligence. It has accused India and China of meddling in its domestic politics. Help us understand this part. Why would India and also why would China do that?
Well, there are a couple of different issues. China is meddling not only in Canadian politics but in all Western countries in a few ways. First of all, by trying to um, control diaspora, because China views Chinese from anywhere, even if they're three generations in born in another country, have never been China, as its own citizens, with obligations towards the mother country, so to speak. So for that reason, they're even opening up police stations illegally in Western countries and basically infiltrating the diaspora, manipulating them, recruiting them for spying and all sorts of influence campaigns and so forth, or intimidating them to vote a particular way. So that's one issue. Another issue is election meddling. They're essentially now starting the sort of propaganda like Russia and Iran is doing, trying to influence elections in the way that will suit their interests. So that's definitely a big part of it, and of course, uh, infiltrating government agencies with spies of all sorts is nothing new, but is becoming increasingly more aggressive. With India, the issue is different. India does not care about the general election outcomes, or while it has good relations with diasporas everywhere and views them as a potential future political force, those diasporas are very diverse, as is India's own population. So there's nothing, so it cannot be controlled the same way simply because the people there are too different. India is a democracy, and it's just impossible to direct huge and diverse people in any particular direction other than just maintaining cultural and business ties with the country and using it as an advantage. India's interests are in the Palestinian issues primarily, and this is where basically Canadian intelligence services are accusing the Indian government of extending resources to spy on these activists, many of whom are very politically involved in Canadian politics, including until most recently at top level as former coalition partners to Trudeau's government. They actually broke up over his economic handling, which they even these separatists thought to be completely disastrous, and they have when your own partners criticize you in public, this is probably not a good sign. But the Canada has accused the Indian intelligence of attempting to assassinate some of these activists who, according to India, have been tied to terrorist activity and not just anti-government propaganda or things like that. So there's a huge disconnect. Clearly, something is not working if the two countries cannot come to a mutually agreeable security arrangement by which no one has to spy on anyone else, and or where you can have some reasonable way of differentiating between opposition that simply doesn't particularly care for Indian politics, but from people who are involved in violence and terrorism, who should not be accepted as having any legitimacy whatsoever, and should be either put on trial in Canada or deported. So I think that is a reasonable and practical arrangement, and I wish Canada was a little bit more open to considering that hosting extremists of any kind and giving them protection is going to attract all sorts of other unrelated extremists who will seize on that opportunity for their own reasons.
Absolutely. And now talking of China, there are reports about, East Palestine, Philippines ceding maritime territory to China, for peace purposes. What about all the support that it has gotten over the years? Help us understand. What should we understand? Is this a fact or is this just news reports?
There was one particular incident in which basically the Philippine forces withdrew from a particular portion of a territory, but they didn't legally give up on it. They didn't say that they're not retaining that claim. Whether they thought that the Chinese forces were too strong or they didn't want to pick a fight at that particular moment for that reason is unclear, but on strategic level, nothing has changed. US continues to back Philippines, and the Philippines continue to be engaged in territorial disputes with China, while also strongly defending their national sovereignty and territorial integrity, amidst these claims. But it is a warning sign that some of these countries, may have strong political will, but they may not have enough resources to withstand pressure from a superpower, which is misallocating resources from its own internal needs towards warfare. And of course, it weakens Chinese economy, but it does strengthen their military clout. And there needs to be an even stronger coalition. Perhaps the Quad should be expanded or should have a more significant regional role to play on a military level, because clearly, one by one, even with all the background backing from the US, all of these smaller countries cannot defend all the territories that China is laying claim to.
Right, right. With here in this part of the world, lot of tussle for this maritime territory, and on the another part of the planet, there's this deadly flooding in West and Central Africa and Eastern and Central Europe. What is happening at that point? Is it only climate, or is it much more, bad governance or anything else?
Well, West Africa is clearly under resourced to deal with, with extreme climatic conditions, which happen once in a while. It's not necessarily a trend, but it just sometimes does happen regardless of the climate. But they are very ill equipped to deal with any of these things. In West Africa and Central Africa, we have seen a series of coups, in part due to bad governance, replaced by even worse governance with a even more problematic backing. And we can see a lot of issues of separatism and jihadist groups and sectarian inter-ethnic warfare happening and spilling over the borders. So there's a lot of turmoil and not a lot of investment into infrastructure, into basic humanitarian support, disaster relief, crisis preparation and planning. Those important issues, and by the way, the reporting of African flooding has been very poorly reported in the Western press, so it's unclear whether how much international support and aid is going to was dealing with those disasters. If people's minds are elsewhere, I don't know how much fundraising they can get out of it. In Central Europe and Eastern Europe, it's a little bit better. There's a better governance and there's somewhat more preparation, but still been devastating and deadly. And Hungary is also having a dispute with the European Union over aid, assistance, and money towards dealing with these issues. Hungary has been also in unrelated disputes with the EU over other issues, issues related to Russia, Ukraine, issues related to migrants. So this is just another point of contention that already is creating fault lines amidst these countries. And of course, there's also a more general split between Western Europe that tends to be kind of more idealistic, and Eastern Europe, which is currently more economy focused.
Wonderful. With this, that's a wrap on for this edition of The World according to Irina Tsukerman on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay tuned for more insightful perspective from Irina on global geopolitics. See you again soon.